Hello everyone, my name is Michael Knipp, and I am here to try to do you a favor. Are you the type of person who read Lord of the Rings, or the Chronicles of Narnia, or some other fantasy a long time ago, and you'd like to get into fantasy, but you aren't sure what the big major players in the game are? Maybe you're one of those people that was sucked in by something like Game of Thrones, and you've either read Game of Thrones or watched Game of Thrones, and you want to know what's going on in the fantasy book realm? This video is for you. I'm here today to talk to you about some of the most popular fantasy book series we have going for us right now and give you a little bit of a brief description for each one to see if it scratches your particular fantasy itch of the moment. Some of these series I've read in their entirety, some of these series I have not. With the exception of one of the series that I'm talking about today, none of these are finished, but all of them are popular and could end up being adapted into some movie or TV show next. And wouldn't you like to be the person that's read them before they're cool so you know what's going on in the fantasy world? If so, this is the video for you. If you like what I'm doing here, please hit the thumbs up on this video. And if you'd like to see more content about science fiction or fantasy books or books in general, please consider subscribing to the channel. If you hit the notification bell, you'll get notified every time I post a new video about the books that I'm reading, the books that I'm excited about, etc. But we're going to start off the video with my favorite fantasy series. It's one of the most popular fantasy series that's currently running. It's by an author named Brandon Sanderson, who is one of the most prolific fantasy writers of our time. And he probably will end up being one of the most prolific fantasy writers of all time, especially because this guy, while he has one of the most ambitious fantasy projects to date, called The Cosmere, which is sort of a book version of the Marvel Cinematic Universe where there's these different fantasy properties that all exist in different worlds with different magic systems. They all tie together in some major and minor ways, some of which we've seen so far and some have yet to come to fruition. But the thing about Brandon Sanderson is he is a workhorse. Unlike some other authors, like George R.R. Martin, who do not publish books very often or on a very good schedule, Brandon Sanderson, he just pumps them out. And it's kind of a joke in the fantasy industry that Brandon Sanderson puts out like 3 books in the time it takes other authors to put out other books. Do I think this affects their quality? Absolutely not. The Cosmere is my favorite thing going on in fantasy right now. I have many videos dedicated to reviewing individual books in the Cosmere, as well as big discussions on some of the larger fantasy series within the Cosmere, because the Cosmere is like fantasy series within a fantasy series. The Cosmere, this greater Brandon Sanderson connected universe, contains some of the biggest popular fantasy titles today, such as Mistborn, which is broken into multiple trilogies that cover different periods of time, but each of those trilogies is a standalone that you can understand the story that's going on in that trilogy. But there's Mistborn, Mistborn Era 2, which these are like hard fantasy magic systems. If you're not aware of what hard magic is, it's where the magic has very specific rules, and then the characters in the world and the reader get to figure out those rules and the ways to exploit them to use more power to accomplish their goals. In addition to the 2 Mistborn trilogies, there's also a book called Elantris and another book called Warbreaker. Those are currently standalones, though the author Brandon Sanderson has said he would like to expand on those specific magic systems and worlds more in the future. But the biggest and hardest hitter inside of the Cosmere is a series called The Stormlight Archive. The Stormlight Archive currently exists in these 4 massive tomes, each of them over 1,000 pages, as well as multiple novellas that exist to flesh out this world. Ultimately, it's supposed to be a 10-book series that we're not even halfway done with, but I love the Stormlight Archive. It's one of the most popular series for a reason. These books have a killer magic system, and they have a lot of amazing character work as well as world building, which explores many different types of magic that exist within this world. And another positive to these books is that it explores different mental health conditions of the main characters as you're going through the series. These books are chunkers and they are massive commitments, but overall, when it comes to certain crazy, huge, thick fantasy series, I think they're very approachable. With Brandon Sanderson's writing style not being overly flowery, it's very straightforward. And compared to other series of this size and scope, at least thus far with the 4 books that we have, it is relatively easy to follow, and there's a lot of things that we do get answered even in these books, but there's still so many more mysteries that are brought up and still yet remain unanswered. None of Brandon Sanderson's series have currently been adapted in any form, though I do have a video if you'd like to check it out where I think Mistborn should be turned into a video game Insomniac style similar to Spider-Man. If you're into video games, you should check out that video. I think I do a decent job of explaining how we could adapt the Mistborn series into a video game. And one of my best friends here on the book internet sphere, his name is Ryan over at Seeking Stories, made an excellent video about how to adapt the first book, The Way of Kings, into its own movie, which some people think is impossible. but Ryan did a killer job of explaining it. If you want to know what's going on in some of the most popular fantasy that exists that has not yet been exposed to people outside of the book world, I'd recommend checking out the Cosmere. Personally, I freaking love it. Next up is a series that works as a good transition between classic fantasy and modern fantasy. I have not yet finished this series for myself. There's 15 books in the series The Wheel of Time, but you may recognize that name because it's about to be turned into a television show on Amazon Prime. There's so much hype building. This is a series that was started in the 90s and continued on through, and weirdly enough, the author unfortunately died before he was able to finish his own series, but the series was still completed by Brandon Sanderson, the writer of the Cosmere, the books I just showed you. Like I said, The Wheel of Time is a bridge gap between classic fantasy with homage to things like Lord of the Rings, and the first book is very similar to that in a lot of stylistic ways. But The Wheel of Time tries to take it a step further and tries to focus more on characters, and there's a lot more world building going on. And hey, if you want to be the guy that knows what's going on with the series before it becomes a television show, you've still got time to start the series. You probably don't have time to finish all 15 books before the show drops this winter, but maybe you do. Just buckle down and do it. Another huge commitment of a series that I haven't finished yet myself is called The Realm of the Elderlings, written by Robin Hobb. Robin Hobb is often an author that you hear associated with pain and sadness because Robin Hobb likes to write books that are very sad, and the characters that earn things in those stories, they don't get them easily. Everything gained in that series is a little bit of a two-step forward, one step back with a lot of suffering, and you have to earn those victories in a Robin Hobb series. This series is broken up into trilogies similar to something like Mistborn, which I mentioned earlier, and each of these trilogies can be digested on their own, though if you're skipping to a trilogy later on, there may be spoilers for something earlier on, so I personally recommend digesting it in bites. The first trilogy in the Realm of the Elderlings is called the Farseer trilogy. This story starts off with a young boy who was left on the castle doorstep. He is the illegitimate son of the next to-be king, who, because of his impropriety and the fact that he had a son out of wedlock, this son is sort of left in a nebulous state within the kingdom. He has to figure out his own way, learn the politics of the kingdom, and you see so much growth in the kingdom and the character. This one is beautifully written. Robin Hobb's prose, especially in the Farseer trilogy, is beautiful. It has this weight to it, unlike something like Brandon Sanderson, which may be more digestible, but more reminiscent of something older like Lord of the Rings, where it feels kind of classic, it feels more dignified, and the way that Robin Hobb tells the story of this kingdom and the way this young boy grows up to be an assassin is a beautiful, haunting, gripping tale. The thing about this series is it's a little bit slower. So if you're looking for something that's not just super fast paced or not just super combat and action heavy, this book has a lot of time to ponder what's going on. There's a lot of heavy and emotional moments. There's a lot of time developing what's going on with the politics in the series. So if you're looking for something that's more of an awesome slow burn with a lot more hidden beauty to it, I recommend The Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb. The next series I'm going to talk about is another massive series with 17 books. This series is called The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. I have a video that I made recently detailing should you read the Dresden Files. I will link that video in the cards up above. But the Dresden Files is a modern day urban fantasy series based in Chicago. And the main character, Harry Dresden, is a wizard for hire. He puts himself in the Yellow Pages, and he's the guy that if you have something supernatural going on and you look for wizard, he's the one you call. The tone of this one is urban fantasy and detective noir. There's also a good bit of humor hidden in there. And the thing about the Dresden Files is that at the beginning, it sort of seems like each of the cases that he's going through are these one-off Monster of the Week fantasies. The thing about the Dresden Files that I realized for myself is that it is subtly and secretly very deep, and some of the things that you take for granted early on mean something important. This one really builds in a way that was completely unexpected for me, and the Dresden Files has become one of my favorite fantasy series ever. This fantasy series was actually adapted as a television show for a little bit, but it has been canceled. I would love to see an adaptation of this done right, but the way that the Dresden Files, over the course of its 17 books, which go by super quickly, unlike some of the other books that I've mentioned, which are really thick and big and chunky, these ones are very digestible. Each one is a lot shorter, even though there's 17 of them. But over the course of those 17 books, there are so many characters that are introduced and become your friends over the course of reading through this one, to the point where it really maximizes on the book form as a medium, because you get so much character development over the course of time, and a lot of time passes over the course of those 17 books, approximately one book per year, and you really get to feel a heart for these characters, and as the world expands, the stakes just get higher, and it's this explosive series that I feel like a lot of people quit early on without realizing how good it is. Don't sleep on the Dresden Files. If anything I said sounds interesting to you, you should check out my video on the Dresden Files specifically and whether or not it's definitely for you. And if you want to read it, please tell me, because I want to talk about the Dresden Files with more people. Up next is a new series called The Burning by Evan Winter, which was originally a self-published book but has now been picked up because it was so freaking good. A lot of the fantasy books that I've been describing have been heavily influenced by European-style fantasies and myths and legends. The Burning is a different take on that. It's more African. And unlike the other series that I've talked about, it is action-packed as it's a revenge story. Something really bad happens to a character at the beginning of the book, and he has to fight his way through a caste system that cares only about warfare. It's wild. At the beginning of this story, the character is so focused on this revenge quest that you are really placed into the gritty, dark details of the combat of this world and the society and how unfair it is. And through the narrative, even though there's so much action, there's literally battles in every single chapter of this book. There's also a lot of subtle things going on about the world building. There's some really dark elements. The magic is played into the world in a really interesting way. And if you're looking for something that just has non-stop action all the time, I'd recommend The Burning. Also, personally, I think this goes without saying, but this is a series ripe for a Netflix adaptation. I think it would be awesome on a screen of some sort, as the action is so visceral. It's just very violent. So if that's what you're looking for, I'd heavily recommend The Burning. Now, if you were a fan of Game of Thrones and you want another series that has yet to be completed because the author has seemingly stopped writing books, I've got another series for you. Originally pitched as a trilogy, the series called The Kingkiller Chronicles currently only exists as 2 books, but what's introduced in those 2 books has audiences captivated in a way that has kept people interested in the series. It's maintained its popularity in the top 10 most popular fantasy series of all time for years, despite having no new entries in the series in a significant amount of time. The Kingkiller Chronicles, which currently exists as The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear, as well as one additional short story, is a series that, even though it isn't complete, has transcended the normal fantasy walls. Many people that haven't read a lot of fantasy have read The Name of the Wind, and I, as just a fantasy reader, don't fully understand it, but as someone who has just recently completed what is available for us in the series, it's really good. I have a video which I will link in the cards up above, which is my sort of detailed, spoiler-free thoughts of the series so far, and I recommend checking it out because it's a little bit of my mind exploding, partially dealing with the fact that this series has not had an edition in so long. It's so good, but it's so confusing, and I just desperately want that 3rd book. I need to know what's going to happen. The Name of the Wind is often praised, similarly to Robin Hobb's work, for its extremely well-written stories. The prose is almost lyrical, and Patrick Rothfuss, the author, knows how to write just beautiful stories into these books. And even when everything happening in the story seems to sort of come out of left field, because there are parts of that story where you're wondering why what's happening is happening, you can't turn away, because the way he tells the story, the world that he's placed you in, the way that he has these characters interact with each other is so gripping. The series is a washed up has-been sort of telling the story about how he became this great mythological figure and then somehow fell out of favor with the world. And I can't tell you how well it delivers because the story hasn't been finished. You see, it's supposed to be a character telling his story over 3 days, and each of the books is supposed to cover one of the days of him recounting the story, but there's only 2 of them. And with the 2 books that we have, there's still so many questions that have not been answered. But even in this state, this is one of the most popular series for a reason. It's so good, even if it's so frustrating sometimes. The last 2 videos that I'm going to talk about in this series are very different in tone, and they're also very recent additions. These are pretty new books, all of them. The first one is called The Band. The series is just called The Band. It's by Nicholas Ames, and this one is a sort of lighthearted take on fantasy, which is a little bit disingenuous because while there's a lot of like juvenile sophomoric humor in this one, there's also a lot of heart hidden in there as well. The books in The Band play out as if a group of close friends is playing Dungeons and Dragons, and this campaign is just busting out before them. Like I said, there's a lot of humor, but also each of these books is framed as if it were a different decade of rock music, and the references, the style, the attitude of each of the books in this series, which has yet to be completed, try to reflect that in ways such as their humor. There's references like pop culture references in it, which may turn a lot of people off, but also a lot of people may find endearing. The first book of the series, Kings of the Wild, is about a bunch of old guys who have to get back together. They used to be really popular fantasy heroes back in the day. They have to get back together to go save one of the characters' daughter. It's like they're has-beens who are doing one last final tour. And the way this story plays out are equal parts hilarious, like super fast-paced, and also it really gut checks you at certain points. The second book in the series, called Bloody Rose, tries to focus on more of an 80s style of rock and roll. And the third book, which should be coming out soon, but I have not seen a release date myself, is going to be focusing on the 90s. And I'm really looking forward to it. I've enjoyed this series in the past, and I just want to see what Nicholas Ames has for the future. If you're someone who enjoys music, this might be one you want to check out. The final series that I'm going to talk about today is called The Green Bone Saga. Now, to many people, this is modern fantasy at its finest. Heavily focused on character work, the author Fonda Lee actually has MBTI profiles for all of her characters to try to maintain a certain consistency of the way that they interact with the story and the world as it changes and what's going on, as well as interact with the other characters in the series. This feels like a series that was really developed in the modern generation. As someone who probably intended their book to be adapted at some point, it feels like it could be turned directly into an HBO TV show without too many major changes happening. The Green Bone Saga is a Chinese-inspired fantasy, think like Triad Wars, because the characters from the series are from different gangs, and the gangs are focused around the trade of this substance called jade, which also happens to give people magical abilities. But in addition to magical abilities, it's also like a drug. So it doubles as this magic drug that can empower people. There's a lot of politics, there's a lot of gang violence and gang strategies, and there's a lot of plot twists and turns. This one isn't one of my favorites, but I seem to be in the minority. The pacing of the series really feels like it is a television show, with very specific like season cliffhangers at the end of each section. And while there's a lot of violence that goes on sort of in the background, the focus on this one is a lot of the politics, maneuverings, strategies, and character moments that are going on in the story instead of being just about action all the time. And book 3 of the Green Bone Saga is about to be released. There are so many people that have been waiting on that one. Once again, if you want to get ahead of something that's probably going to be adapted at some point, you should probably pick up the Green Bone Saga. And that does it. I hope that I have done you guys a favor. If you're a fantasy fan looking for something else to chomp down on, I hope I've piqued your interest with at least one of these series, if not more than one. Of course, this isn't an exhaustive list, so I'm sure that there are going to be people arguing in the comments down below of things that I didn't include that I should have. If you're someone who's looking forward to getting into fantasy, let me know in the comments down below which one sounds the most interesting to you. If you'd like to talk about the stuff I talked about in this video or any other book-related topic, or ask questions about any of the fantasy series that I've talked about here, or maybe one I didn't talk about that you've heard about, there's a link in the video description down below to my Discord with our people, lovely people who are just chomping at the bit to talk to people about fantasy books. In fact, there are dedicated channels in my Discord to talk about most of the fantasy series here. If you know someone who's a fantasy fan who's looking for something awesome to read, please share this video with them. It's a pretty awesome overview of a bunch of different styles of adult fantasy that are available today. And once again, please, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up. I can't wait to talk about books again with you guys sometime in the near future. Thank you so much for watching. I love you. Goodbye.
Sleep, no one ever get enough. Always looking out tired. Sleep, no one ever get enough. If it don't show up, I might get fired. Sleep, no one ever get enough. Always looking out tired. Sleep, no one ever get enough. If I don't show up, I might get fired.